Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to show you how to change the serpentine belt and the serpentine belt tensioner pulley bearing on a third generation Honda Fit. For some other modern compact cars this might be a similar procedure, although I recommend looking up online the specifics about your car. So let's get started. To start out with, because the Fit is a very low car and we're going to need to be accessing the underside of it, jacking it up and all that, a good trick to get the jack in the center jacking point of the car is to put it up on some ramps, or you can use some 2x4s or some timber, whatever you have. This just allows you to slide the jack in and jack it on the center jacking post. But before we jack it up, we need to make sure that the lug nuts on the passenger side wheel are loose, because whenever it's in the air and the front is just in park, even if it's in park, this happens, and you don't want that. So you need to loosen the lug nuts slightly, just break them loose with the tire iron that is in the back of the trunk. The center jacking post is right here, and on most cars it looks pretty similar to this. This one just happens to be pretty far back relative to this car's height. So it's jacked up. Next step is we place jack stands on each of the pinch welds on the car. And if you're on an asphalt driveway, and even if you're not, I recommend placing some scrap wood underneath the jack stands so that they don't put divots into your driveway. Then you can lower the jacks, and now your car is supported firmly on the jack stands. And I like to give it a little push just to make sure that it is nice and solid. You don't want it falling down while you're working on this. You can loosen the lug nuts the rest of the way and remove the wheel. And if the wheel is stuck, a rubber mallet hitting on the inside rim of the wheel is a good way to get it to pop off. So now that the wheel is off, you can see that this panel here is the one that needs to come off in order to access the serpentine belt easily. This is held on primarily with plastic pins, and I found that a good way to remove these is to be a little less careful than you think you need to be and use two flat blade screwdrivers sort of wedged in like this. After you do this enough times, you'll get the hang of it. But initially just sort of go slow till it comes out, and then you can just remove it. Now that the inner wheel well is off, we can access the tensioner. I highly recommend a serpentine belt tool for this. You can pick one up at Harbor Freight, and it has all the right size sockets for what you need. It's like $10, $15. The cost of this tool and the serpentine belt is going to be like less than half of what it would cost to do this at an actual shop. And then you'll have this tool forever if it doesn't break. The serpentine belt, the reason that we're under here is because the underside of the car is where you're supposed to access this from. From the top, there really isn't enough room to get to the hex on the end of the tensioner. So what you want to do is put the wrench on the tensioner hex and pull so that it releases tension from the belt. And then when it does this, you slide the belt sideways off of the pulleys and remove the belt. And then you can release the tensioner, and now you have the old belt. And now if all you were doing was replacing the belt, which is what you need to do like 80% of the time, this is where you would then just do the same in reverse and put the belt back on. However, the belt is a little bit difficult to put back on, especially a new one. It isn't really stretched at all. And it takes a while to put back on if you aren't practiced. You have to really push it on from the side, even if the tensioner is all the way released with the wrench. However, it eventually does work, but you do want to make sure that it is centered in all of the pulleys, because this is a ribbed belt, and if it is not in the right spot, it will quickly tear itself apart and, of course, cause damage. So just look at it and make sure everything looks straight. Perhaps start up the car while it's in this position so that you can double check that it runs before you commit to putting it all back up and then starting to drive it away when you realize, oh, it breaks. However, I was paranoid that it was the bearing in the tensioner itself, because it's just one bearing put on this pulley in this tensioner mechanism. And by the way, this is what the tensioner mechanism looks like. And to remove the tensioner, there are two bolts that you need to remove that are along the tensioner. If you look at what this tensioner looks like, you can see where those bolts are. Now, a lot of times this whole tensioner assembly is replaced. It's going to run you about $70, $70 to $100 for a new tensioner. A lot of times it's just this bearing that fails. So what I did is I ordered the bearing. All the parts links are in the description. I pressed out the old one. Now, I say pressed, I really hit it out. This really you only want to do if you're sure that it's the bearing. If there's just a little bit of play in the bearing side to side, that's perfectly normal. But if it's really flopping around and making a grinding noise, then you really need to change it. The reason I say you need to be sure is because this step is destructive to the old bearing, because I essentially just hammered it out with a socket of the size of the center bearing race until it came out. And you also don't want to damage the pulley itself, because that's also another difficult part to replace. Although you can buy just the pulley and bearing as a unit, although I question the suppliers from these sometimes because it's hard to get OEM parts. But anyway, now that the bearing is out, we have to put the new one back in, and we have to be careful with this one. Luckily, it's a lot easier to put back in so long as you have a large bench vise and a large socket. Again, I bought a set of sockets specifically for this task of just being a thing to impinge upon the outer race of the bearing in a bench vise. For a bearing this big, and in a pulley like this, it's okay to use a large bench vise. It's not going to put too much force on it, but if you have a smaller bench vise, this really isn't going to work. I don't recommend using a hammer for this, but if you absolutely need to, you probably can get away with it. You most likely don't need to change this bearing anyway. I'm just showing you what I did. And once everything is back together, there you go, you're done. You can lower the car by lifting it up from the center jacking point, removing the two front jack stands, replacing the ramps that the car was on, lowering the car onto the ramps, and then reversing off the ramps. And now you are done. Thanks for watching.